life, many of my projects involve using this bandsaw. And yes, I have made a lot of mistakes and ended up with a lot of useless pieces of metal, but that's the way things happen. We're going to start by making the frame for the tabletop itself. We take the mitered pieces, clamp them down in this miter jig that I made, and weld them together. Before we go too much further in this project, let me show you what I am trying to do. The object is to put a shelf above the sewing table, but without the legs that can interfere with my cutting of my fabric. So let's start by first getting rid of the front legs, moving the shelf back a few inches, and extending the rear legs all the way to the floor. On the floor, there will be 2 feet. The front of each foot will extend under the table to offset the center of gravity and balance the table. To make it easier to transport, we'll make it in 2 pieces. So you lift the top piece as seen here, line it up with the legs of the bottom piece, and you insert the legs of the top piece into the bottom piece as seen here. Here's the frame for the top of the table. Now we're going to assemble the top leg assembly. Before we weld the struts that hold the legs together, we have to create a special jig. You have to understand that stainless steel warps as you try to weld it due to the nature of the steel and the heat. This is an animation of what the warping may look like. To prevent this, we're going to create a jig as you see here. What is not shown are the clamps. That prevents the metal from warping as we weld the brace you see below. Here you see me start by welding a foot to the jig so it will stay upright. Once that is done, then I will proceed to create the end pieces using a series of clamps to hold the pipes rigidly in a known position to prevent them from warping when I proceed with the welding. With all the jigs done, it is now time to perform the welding of the braces or the struts to hold the leg assembly in place. The heavy metal bar holds everything firmly down to the table to minimize any warping due to the welding. Once I'm finished welding the second strut, that completes the assembly of the top leg assembly. It is now time to start putting the jig on the bottom leg assembly, remembering that these legs are bigger so that the legs for the top can be inserted inside them. You'll see me do a test insertion once things are firmly clamped in place. Once I'm happy with the way the insertion works, I will now proceed to weld the struts for the bottom assembly to hold the bottom assembly together. I do brief tack welding on both sides of the assembly alternately to reduce warping. Despite this precaution, when I do my final test insertion, you notice that it sticks, but it's okay. Next, I'm going to use a special circular cutting tool to contour the bottoms of the bottom legs so they contour or fit around the feet, as you can see. After this, we're ready to weld together the bottom assembly. First, we must clamp everything firmly in place, because you never want to try to hold something with your hands while doing the welding. Once the clamping is done, we then use a square to make sure the assembly is properly squared and in the correct location before we do the welding. Unfortunately, I forgot to videotape the welding I did at this step. I just want to say it's only a quick spot weld to hold everything in place so that I can remove all of the jigs before performing the more formal welding. The final welding consists of performing several spot welds, alternating both sides of each legs and both legs to reduce warping. Once this is done, we can now weld on the struts that provide bracing for the bottom legs. The bottom is now done. Now it's time for the top assembly. This is the table assembly. I'm clamping down the pieces that will hold the bracing in place, which in turn will hold the legs in place against the top table assembly. Remembering, you never want to try to hold something in place with your hands while welding because of accidental movement or possible burn. So everything must be firmly clamped, properly squared, and held in place and checked before doing the first tack weld that will hold all the pieces firmly in place so that I can remove the bracing and the jigs to perform the more formal welding, which is a series of alternate tack welding and requiring constantly moving and turning the entire assembly around, being careful knowing that the tack welds are not very strong. Once the series of tack welds alternately applied to both legs and both sides of each leg is done, it is time to install the bracing necessary to provide support for the table. We first grind the 45 degrees into each brace and proceed to weld the bracing onto the legs. Any warping here should be held minimal because of the welding already performed from the legs to the top. Once it is done, the overall welding is complete. All that's left to do is to weld in the 4 tabs to hold the wooden tabletop in the frame. We're only going to show 2 of them for brevity. Once these are done, we do a final check to make sure that the insertion goes okay, which it does. Then comes time to measure and cut the wooden tabletop that will be put into the assembly. I'm just using some scrap wood from a previous project because I don't care how the top of the table looks. Once this is done, I'm ready to install it behind my sewing table. Here you see me first putting the bottom assembly against the wall behind my sewing table. Next, you'll see me inserting the top into the bottom just as you saw in the animation. Once that's done, we put the sewing table back in place and the project is now complete. As you can see, the entire cutting surface is now free of debris. Thank you for watching, and of course, I love you all.